The year was 1943, and the war had left southern Italy in ruins. Bombs had torn open the roofs of churches, streets were littered with stones, and whole villages prayed only for the next day to come. It was here, in a shattered town near Naples, that an American soldier heard something that should have been impossible. Private Daniel Whitaker, a radio operator with the U.S. Fifth Army, had been stationed in Italy for 3 weeks. He was not a remarkable man in any military sense. He carried his orders without complaint, kept a small photograph of his wife folded into his pocket, and prayed quietly each evening in the corner of his tent. To those around him, Daniel was only another tired face among many. But inside, he carried a wound far older than the war itself. 7 years earlier, in 1936, his wife Evelyn had been declared dead. A house fire in Ohio had taken her, or so he believed. Her body was never fully recovered, but the authorities concluded she could not have survived. The grief broke Daniel, but as the years went on, he buried it as best he could. He never remarried. He kept only a memory, a soft smile, and the name she called him by when no one else was around: Danny Boy. On the night of August 12th, 1943, Daniel was repairing a signal line near the ruins of a bombed chapel. The roof was gone, the altar cracked, but one wall still stood with a faded painting of the Virgin Mary. Villagers had placed candles at the base of the wall, and even in war, they came to pray. Daniel crouched nearby, his equipment scattered on the ground. When he swore, he heard a voice. The sound was soft, almost like a song carried on the wind, but the words struck him like a blade. Danny Boy. No one in the unit called him that. No one could have known it. His head snapped up, but there was only the broken chapel and the glow of wax burning low. He froze, his hand gripping the earth. The whisper came again, faint but clear, and in it he thought he heard Evelyn. Daniel stumbled back, almost tearing the wire he had been fixing. His fellow operator, Sergeant Miller, saw him pale as chalk. Miller later wrote in his diary, "Whitaker stared at the wall like a man who had seen a ghost. He said nothing, but his lips moved as if answering someone who was not there." That was the first sign. The next morning, Daniel returned to the chapel alone. He wanted to prove to himself that he had imagined it, that grief and exhaustion had made him weak. But when he stepped inside, he noticed something he had not seen before. On the cracked plaster, where the Virgin Mary's face had been painted, the features had blurred. War damage had eaten away the colors. Yet the shape that remained seemed, to Daniel's eyes, unmistakable. It was the face of Evelyn, the curve of the cheek, the line of the lips, softened by age, worn by fire and dust, but still her. He pressed his hand to the stone, trembling. Later, he would tell a chaplain that in that moment he did not know whether he was standing before a holy icon or the memory of a lost woman made visible through faith. But he knew one thing: the voice and the vision were tied, and neither should have been possible. By the end of the week, whispers spread through the battalion. Men spoke of Whitaker praying longer than the rest, of him sketching faces in the dirt with his boots. Miller wrote again, "Something in him has changed. He looks less broken, but also less here. As if part of him is listening to someone we cannot hear. On August 18th, the event became harder to dismiss. A villager named Maria Rossi, who cleaned what remained of the chapel, approached Daniel with a small object wrapped in cloth. It was a fragment of painted plaster, chipped from the wall during the bombing. On its surface was part of the Virgin's eye and part of the cheek. Maria pressed it into his hands and said, "Lei è con te." She is with you. Daniel stared at the fragment, and for the first time in 7 years, he smiled. But behind that smile lay the start of a mystery that would soon entangle soldiers, priests, and government officials. For in that ruined Italian church, a man who had long mourned his wife was now certain she had returned, not in body, but in a vision of the Virgin Mary. The story might have ended with a single whisper and a broken wall, but war never left time for quiet miracles. Within days, Daniel's experience at the chapel began to spread among soldiers and locals alike, and each retelling added more weight to what had happened. At first, the officers dismissed it. A man under stress, exhausted by combat, remembering a lost wife. It was normal, even expected. But then other things began to happen. On August 21st, 1943, during a field mass held among the ruins, the choir of local children sang a Marian hymn. The words were in Italian, but Daniel swore he heard one name repeated, Evelyn. His body went rigid. Witnesses later said he trembled as though struck by fever and then collapsed into the dust. The chaplain, Father Donnelly, wrote in his notes, "Private Whitaker fainted during a mass after hearing the name of his departed wife. No one here knows that name. I do not know what to make of it." The incident left the unit uneasy. Some thought Daniel cursed. Others whispered that the Virgin herself had chosen to speak through him. 2 days later, while repairing equipment near the same chapel, Daniel shouted something in Italian, a language he did not speak. Sergeant Miller, again nearby, recorded it in his diary. Whitaker cried out a phrase I could not follow. The villagers gasped. Later they told me it meant, "She walks among the living." How would he know those words? He barely manages English when tired. It was no longer just grief. Something else was moving through him, and more people began to notice. The villagers treated Daniel with reverence. Women touched his sleeve as he passed, hoping for a blessing. Children followed him, asking if he could hear the Virgin's voice again. Maria Rossi, who had given him the fragment of plaster, swore she saw him lit by a strange glow when he prayed in the chapel at night. She told Father Donnelly, "It was as if the Holy Mother herself was near him." His lips moved, but I heard another voice with his. Daniel himself became quiet, but not withdrawn. Instead, he carried a notebook in which he drew simple sketches. Always the same, the Virgin Mary, but with Evelyn's face. The drawings unnerved his comrades. It was one thing to mourn, but another to repeat the image until it filled every page. Then came the event that forced even his officers to pay attention. On the evening of August 27th, Daniel's unit was ordered to move forward toward a ridge often shelled by German artillery. As they prepared to leave, Daniel suddenly froze, his face pale. He claimed to hear Evelyn's voice again, urgent, pleading. He refused to step onto the road. When Sergeant Miller pressed him, Daniel shouted, "Not this path, not tonight. She says no." The men laughed. some cursed, but Daniel would not move. At last, Miller gave in and led them by another track that curved farther east. Hours later, word came back. The original road had been hit by artillery fire. Several men from another unit were killed. Miller never forgot that night. His diary reads, "We thought him mad, but if we had gone the way planned, we would be corpses now. I do not know if it was luck, madness, or miracle, but he saved us." From that point on, Daniel's presence divided the unit. Some saw him as blessed, a man whose wife had returned as a messenger of the Virgin. Others muttered that he was unstable, dangerous, perhaps even possessed. The commanding officer filed a report to headquarters, noting Daniel's episodes and the strange influence he seemed to have. The language was cautious, but the meaning was clear. Private Whitaker was no longer only a soldier. He was becoming a problem. By early September, Daniel's visions came more often. At night, he woke screaming, calling Evelyn's name. In the mornings, he wrote words in his notebook that no one could understand, fragments of Latin mixed with shapes that looked like prayers, but were not. Father Donnelly tried to guide him, but Daniel only shook his head. "She is not gone," he told the chaplain. "She is here, through her, through the mother. They do not want me to speak, but I must." It was then that the matter left the hands of his unit and drew the attention of higher command. A military psychiatrist was ordered to examine him, but the villagers who had seen his visions did not want him taken. They believed his wife's face was a sign from heaven, and they feared the Americans would silence it. The chapel remained lit with candles long after Daniel was moved away for questioning. In their eyes, the Virgin had spoken, and a soldier's grief had become something far greater than himself. When Private Daniel Whitaker was taken from the village, his story did not end. If anything, it grew stranger. He was sent to a field hospital north of Naples for evaluation. Officially, this was for exhaustion and possible hallucinations, but files uncovered decades later show that military doctors treated him as more than a medical case. They wanted to know how a soldier could predict danger, how his visions seemed tied to real events. One report, dated September 9th, 1943, read, "Subject claims to see deceased wife within visions of the Virgin Mary. Episodes increase near ruins of churches. Subject displays knowledge of Italian language he does not speak. Recommend continued observation. Possible influence on troop morale." The word influence was underlined twice. While Daniel was kept under watch, Father Donnelly tried to speak for him. The chaplain wrote letters saying the man should be treated with compassion, not suspicion. But those letters never reached higher command. They were filed away, marked classified. The villagers also kept their faith. Maria Rossi and others left notes at the chapel asking Evelyn, or the Virgin through Evelyn, for protection. These scraps of paper, burned at the edges from candlelight, were collected later by Italian clergy. Some survive today in parish archives, each marked with the date, autumn 1943. Then came the detail no one could explain. The Army asked for records from Ohio about Evelyn Whitaker's death. The answer that came back was strange. The fire had indeed destroyed the home, but the local registry book had a missing page. The entry with Evelyn's name had been torn out. No one knew when or why. Worse, Daniel was shown a photograph taken years after 1936. It was of a Marian procession in a small town in Illinois. Among the crowd was a woman who looked exactly like Evelyn. Her face turned toward the camera, blurred but clear enough for recognition. The photo had been sent in by a priest who had noticed the likeness. He too wrote, "Is it possible she lives, or is it the mother showing herself through familiar form?" Daniel never saw the photograph again. In later months, more files collected around his case. Reports of him writing prayers mixed with his wife's name. Notes of him sketching her face inside a halo of stars. And one chilling entry from a nurse who sat with him during a fever. He whispered that she is neither dead nor alive. She is chosen, and through her, I am chosen too. By winter 1943, Daniel was quietly transferred out of Italy. Records suggest he was sent back to the United States under the cover of medical leave. The official reason was combat fatigue, but his file carried another stamp, restricted. And then, silence. For years, no more was heard. His unit went on without him. The chapel fell fully into ruin, and the villagers carried the story only in whispers. Yet in 1947, another Marian apparition was reported in Sicily. Photographs from the event show a blurred figure on the damaged wall of a church. To some, the face looks like the Virgin. To others, like Evelyn Whitaker. Scholars who studied the files decades later pointed out one more thread. Daniel lived quietly in Ohio until his death in 1962, but in his last journal, discovered by a relative, he wrote, "I see her still, not only in dreams, but in light. She waits in the places between. One day, all will see what I saw in 1943. What is certain is that one soldier, in the ruins of a war-torn land, believed the wife he had lost had returned to him in the face of the Virgin Mary. Whether this was grief, miracle, or something stranger, no record can prove. But the missing registry page, the blurred photographs, and the prayers of villagers leave one final question. If some visions are born from memory, what happens when memory itself is written into history? Today, few remember Daniel Whitaker. He was not a general, not a hero on the front page. He was only a man who mourned and who thought he saw his wife again where no one expected her. The chapel is gone. The war is long over. But the fragments of plaster and the strange reports remain. Some say it was only the mind trying to heal. Others whisper it was proof that the holy can wear the faces we loved most. And perhaps, in some way, both are true. This has been a fictional story, told in the style of forgotten archives and lost testimonies. If you want to hear more stories like this one, subscribe to our channel and tap the bell.